Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. As Abdon said, my name is Jacob Briskman, and I'm an attorney here in Chicago in private practice. And I must advise everyone this event is being recorded. And we're here today to discuss and to propose what to do about the undocumented population in this country. Estimates suggest that there are between 10 and 12 million people in the United States without legal status. This may be because they entered without inspection or they overstayed a visa. We're going to start the debate in a few minutes, and each participant will be giving a short introduction to introduce themselves and their position. And the introduction is going to be 2.5 minutes each. Before we get started, I want to give a couple background points and housekeeping matters. Firstly, I want to give a very brief thumbnail sketch of the history of immigration laws in this country, for those that might not be familiar. Until 1882, anyone could come to the country unless they were beset by an illness or were ruled out under a few other limited exceptions. For example, anarchists. And then in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring all Chinese immigration. And then in 1921 was the first time quotas were introduced, limiting immigration from specific countries to 3% of the population of that country that was actually in the United States at the time. Those national origin quotas were abolished in 1965, and where numerical caps were set. And then in 1986, under President Ronald Reagan, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed, providing amnesty for approximately 3 million people who are without legal status. In the last 28 years, there have been many changes, and during that period, many people have come to the United States without legal status or have overstayed their visa. As I said, estimates are between 10 and 12 million, but some estimates are as low as 7, high as 20 million. Which brings me to some of the terminology used in this debate. While amnesty and alien are often used in this debate, sometimes as negative terms, they really, in fact, have the same meaning as legalization and undocumented person. So I'd really like us to try to focus on the substance instead of the terms used. And lastly, and most importantly, as I've already mentioned to the participants, we know this is a very emotionally charged subject. And as we know in law, when arguing our case, respect toward our opponent is essential. We cannot engage in hostile language, attacks, or name-calling. Rather, the discussion and audience questions must be respectfully put forward and their positions to focus on the merits of their argument and the strengths or weaknesses of the other arguments. And we're going to save time at the end, so there'll be about 6 or 7 questions after the introduction, 2-minute responses each. And Abdon will be giving the 25-second warning on each participant's answer. And we ask that if you have an audience question, you write it down on a piece of paper and hand it up to the front to Peter, and we'll be reading off the questions at the end of the participant time. So without further ado, here are our members of the panel. We have Professor Linus Chan from the University of Minnesota Law School and the Center for New Americans. We have Dan Stein, the president of the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And we also have Professor Alexandra Filindra of the University of Illinois Chicago, professor of political science. Join me in welcoming the panelists. So we're going to start with Linus. Mr. Chan, 2.5 minutes. Introduction. Thank you.
All right, well, I probably won't take 2.5 minutes, or I hope I don't. So my name is Linus Chan. I'm coming back to Chicago. I just left in December. I used to work at DePaul University, and then before DePaul, I was at the National Immigrant Justice Center. So why is it that when Jake asked me whether or not I wanted to come and have this discussion, I agreed to fly all the way back from the icy winter north of Minnesota? I think the answer is pretty simple. I think a lot of the times we have a back and forth that isn't really productive or constructive, especially when it comes to immigration. And it's understandable, right? I mean, for many people, immigration is about their family members. It's about their sons, their daughters, their husband, their wives, their grandparents. And for others, immigration can be about their way of life. It can be about what they see as they are threatened by what's going on with their community. It's about the unknown, and of course, it's about their jobs and about their safety and their own concern. So it's not surprising that these debates are very emotional and can be difficult. But I think one thing that I'm hoping to come to share with is my perspective as someone who has been a lawyer, who has directly been working with clients who are facing the prospect of deportation. And what we are seeing in that deportation machine, so to speak, and what I see as a very cruel and in many ways unjust system, and one thing that needs a lot of discussion about and talks about reform. So often we're talking about the economic effects, which we will do today, but I do think there is definitely a question about values and about what it is that we want our country to represent when it comes to talking about immigration.
Thank you. Mr. Stein?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. I have been looking at this issue now going on. This is my 33rd year in one way or another with FAIR. Before that, I worked on Capitol Hill for a House committee beginning in 1977. And while I was doing that, I was actually studying crop substitution programs in Latin America as a way of furthering economic development to discourage migration pressures in the South. So it's really been over about 35 years I've been looking at the topic. The reality is that the immigration topic has become more contentious now than ever, and there are reasons for that that have to do with the political polarization of the issue. There were a number of presidential commissions in the last 30 years, including the Hesburgh Commission chaired by Father Hesburgh in 1979. Barbara Jordan, the late Barbara Jordan, distinguished civil rights leader, chaired a commission that gave its report in the 1990s. And those commissions, and there have been several others, and those commissions sought to take an enlarged view of the national interest in the questions of how many immigrants are we going to admit, and then who are they going to be, and then, of course, most importantly, how we enforce the rules. And what we've tried to do at FAIR is help the American people focus on the enlarged considerations of how U.S. immigration policy should be set, how the numerical limit should be enforced, how do rapid population growth increases stress U.S. natural resources, such as water, for example, that we see now in California, and certainly we're going to see in Texas in the coming years, and other natural resource issues, congestion, crowding, cultural issues, certainly economic and displacement issues. But at this juncture of the national debate, what we have is a real political quandary, because the division between the two parties seems to fall down along very strong ideological positions, which don't seem amenable to resolution, but I'm hoping maybe we can have some constructive dialogue about that today.
Professor Filindra.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Filindra, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Illinois. Prior to that, I was a professor at Brown University. I taught there, and I've spent many years studying immigration policy. It didn't start out that way. I came here to do my PhD in European studies, but after spending in the U.S. over 20 years and not able to get a green card, I had to figure out what was going on and why. So I went to one of my professors at Rutgers University, and I said, I don't know anything about immigration, but I want to do a PhD on immigration policy because it's personally relevant, because I want to understand why is it that this country has offered me incredible opportunities, unbelievable generosity. I am one of the few fortunate people who have no student loans because all of my education was paid through different funds that private institutions and others in this country provided. But still, that was not enough for me to be able to make the transition to stay here. So that's where my journey started as a scholar of immigration, and I have been writing on the issue for the past several years. I am also a new American. I became an American citizen less than a year ago, and probably that makes me about as new as they come, right? And as a new American, and having been through this process, I have to say that I am very proud and honored to share this land with the millions of people who sought to flee destitution and violence and to support their family in the only way available to them, by crossing the border. As Jeb Bush said last week, this is an act of love and compassion and commitment to family. It's not a felony. And I find their efforts and I find what they're doing to be the responsible thing to do. And I believe that the onus lies with the state, with our government, to find ways to make it easier for people to stay home or easier for people to come here. We cannot create felons out of people who are seeking to help their families.
Thank you. First question, we're going to start with Dr. Filindra and move to the right. My right, audience's left. How should we understand the impact of undocumented immigration in the United States? What is important to know, and what has not been getting a lot of attention?
Much of the debate on the impact of immigrants in the United States has focused on the minutia of economics. What are the effects of immigration on wages, the short-term effects, the long-term effects, for which groups, and any change, social or economic change, has winners and losers. And if you drill down in any situation, you will find somebody inevitably wins and somebody loses. And you can always frame a debate like that in many different ways. From my perspective, I studied political psychology, and what I've learned from political psychology is that the economic logic is subordinate to social logic. As most economists and practically all cognitive psychologists would tell you, human behavior is seldom driven by economic rationality. After all, it is not economically rational, right, for a mother not to feed her child. But how many mothers do you know who tell their babies, sorry, dude, there ain't more milk, go get it, right? What is worse is that we have the knowledge from the vast and fascinating study of cognition and the invaluable work that cognitive scientists have developed to understand and predict both migratory behavior and the responses to migration. But we tend to hide, as policy analysts and policymakers, behind antiquated theories of supply and demand, and we pretend that people are the same thing as widgets. Well, unfortunately, they're not, and these models really are not helpful. Economic rationality and rational choice in general may be comforting for those who feel lost in a world in all shades of gray, but it is a fiction. And this fiction may resonate with the regular folk on Main Street who understand people stealing our jobs, people taking away resources, but what is accepted as folk logic is not what us as scientists and as educated people we should be using. We should use the latest tools from social science to understand the phenomenon and design policy. And it is important for us to start and think about the bigger picture. understand what causes migration, understand why is it that actually migration flows are so limited. Given a supply and demand model, you basically should expect that a lot more people than actually do should move. But only 1 or 2% of the global population migrates. So if that's the case, we need to understand not why we have so many migrants, but actually why we have so few. And our models coming from economics are not sufficient for that. So I think that we need to start with a foundational level and not turn this debate to the nitty-gritty of who loses and who gains. We need a much stronger understanding of the phenomenon before we get into the minutia. Because when we start talking about who loses and who gains, we get into a different kind of debate and a different kind of conversation, which is fraught with all kinds of other problems about how we understand groups and how we frame groups. So I think that we need really to be a lot more cognizant of what science has to tell us about the phenomenon, bring in the latest understandings out of political science and psychology about how migration works, and then design approaches that are the best both for the communities here and for the people from who are coming here from other countries.
Thank you. Mr. Stein, how should we understand the impact of undocumented immigration in the United States?
Well, I represent a broad swath of the general public that are members of my organization, so I'm taking this from the position of a sort of a general public point of view, that respect for law is the cornerstone of citizenship. We have a highly, excuse me, it's freezing in Chicago, we have a highly diverse society, and to a great extent we don't really share that many cultural or historical traditions anymore, and one of the things that really enables us to cohere as a civil polity is respect for law. That part of why people do want to come here from all over the world is they have an understanding that our system, they feel it works, that this is not a country where you need to bribe officials to get special favors through the criminal justice system. It's a place where there's functionality in the system of justice, and that procedural process, that process that is due, is forthcoming without any special connections, that the United States works. The whole idea behind respect for law, it's one of those parts of the threadbare component of the cohesive bonds that enable us to really function as a cohesive community. You work hard, you play by the rules, you work hard, maybe you'll do well, maybe you'll have a shot at the American dream. That's the social contract in which we all live and try to function. The public in general feels that it has worked very hard, I think, collectively through Congress to try to deter illegal immigration over the last 30 years. There have been a number of efforts legislatively and otherwise. And the fact of the matter is that in order for a democracy like ours to work, it has to be the public through its elected representatives who decide how many and who come into the country and where those limits are going to be set and how they're going to be enforced. Because if you don't enforce the rules, then ultimately you have chaos. You have the adhocracy of people selecting based on their willingness to come illegally and break the rules. It's fundamentally antithetical to the American ideal of fairness to think that preferences should be given to people who wait patiently around the world for their visa priority numbers to come up over those who jump the line and seek to gain an advantage by virtue of having not only broken U.S. law, and Jeb Bush is incorrect when he says it's not a crime. Of course, it is a misdemeanor initially, and being here illegally frequently entails a variety of other felonies associated with fraudulent IDs and failure to file taxes and a variety of other things. People who are asking to be able to jump the line are being asked not only to not be prosecuted for those various criminal violations that they've committed in the course of being here, in addition to the criminal offense of procuring entry, they're also being asked, they're asking for a privilege, a benefit, the right to stay in this country legally and ultimately a route to citizenship, as opposed to what most countries would consider strictly amnesty, which is to give somebody 6 months to get their affairs in order and leave the country, or they won't be prosecuted. So it's really an amnesty and a reward, if you will, which properly understood incentivizes further illegal immigration, which it does. Illegal immigration, while it's certainly understandable in certain motivational contexts, depending on what we're talking about, is also situational in that it responds frequently to messages that are sent by the country itself. So, for example, as we speak, there is a rapid surge of additional illegal immigration taking place in South Texas because the Obama administration has made it clear that they're going to enforce a very lax standard for what we call credible fear determinations in the asylum context, and then they're going to set a hearing date and release those folks with a high probability they won't show up for a hearing. When the word gets out, there's a pipeline effect, network recruitment. People make the decision to move based on expectations of what they're going to find. So what we find is that a very clear and consistent message being sent by the United States has a very powerful effect in deterring illegal immigration. People should be told, look, if you don't play by the rules of the game, you're not going to be able to play the game. And that if you're allowed to, if you take a look at the president's aunt, Zatoumi, who just passed away the other day, she was a textbook case of someone who had been given all her procedural rights in the asylum context. She'd repeatedly thumbed her nose at our immigration system. She'd been allowed to stay repeatedly and eventually was able to get asylum on very questionable grounds while collecting public benefits. And this is the sort of thing that breeds cynicism in the general public's views that our asylum and immigration control system is working as effectively as it's advertised. So there are reasons these things happen. It's not a mystery, and it's ultimately up to the American people to decide how to remedy it.
Thank you.
So I think it's really easy in this debate, on this discussion, to start trying to describe what's on the ground. What are the motivations of people? And I think it's really important when we talk about undocumented immigration that we avoid a few pitfalls. And I think one pitfall that comes about is trying to figure out, well, how different are undocumented immigrants from the rest of us? Are they more law-breaking? Are they less? Are they more people who care about their families? Are they less? Don't get me wrong, I think that debate or that study is a worthwhile academic endeavor. But when we're talking about the laws that we create, and when we're talking about the policies that we are enforcing when it comes to undocumented immigration, the real question that needs to be asked is, how do those laws reflect on us? Now, Mr. Stein has made a point that these laws and the way that they're enforced reflect upon us about whether or not we have respect for the law. That if we go ahead and create rules that are not being enforced properly, we are essentially telling the world that we don't have a certain respect for the laws that we've created. I think my position is quite different. My position is that the laws that we create and how we treat immigrants completely are an absolute reflection of the values that we're supposed to uphold as a country. We often talk about, and it becomes such a throwaway line, that we are a nation of immigrants, that our history is a country that's made by immigrants. But really, the question then becomes, what are we in terms of how we treat immigrants? Right? One of the things that you see in the evangelical movement is really the idea of welcoming the stranger. Well, how do we decide to treat people when we decide to treat them as people? So one of the things that I think is kind of lost a little bit, not only is this idea of what are the migration flows, the zero-sum game of economics, but really, what are the policies when we create immigration law? First, how do they reflect on us? Do we want to continue to put people in jail for being the crime of undocumented immigration? And it's a crime because we've labeled it as a crime, not because there's a agreed upon necessarily what crime means. It's a crime because we've labeled it so. So the question, of course, then becomes, what laws are ones that are effective? Do we know, of course, we know that there are some laws that are just bad laws. Do the laws that we've created, this immigration system that we've done, which is supposed to handle a huge myriad of questions, how to handle labor force, how to handle the economy, how to handle natural resources, but also how to reflect our values when it comes to protecting those fleeing persecution, and then what it does in terms of how we recognize that family ties are important. If the laws are not effective, then they need to be changed. One way, one measurement of whether a law is effective is whether it's enforceable and whether or not people naturally will follow them. You know, I actually have a college degree in philosophy, and there's a big debate, right? Rawls theory, all these philosophical debates about what is a just law. Is it just a law because we all socially contracted agree to it? But then it becomes difficult to say that a social contract would be binding on people who's not part of that society, right? But then on the other hand, is it a moral aspect? Are we saying there's a moral impediment to this, which is why Professor Filindra and Jeb Bush is talking about it as a labor of love. So if the law is not effective, then it is on our onus to decide how to change it to make it one that actually is both effective and reflects our values. Respect for law is great. But our history has shown that one of the greatness of our country is that we are able to discard the laws that are not just and that do not reflect our society. And there are many times where that's happened. And my position would be that this is a situation, once again, that our 30-year experiment needs to change.
Thank you. The response order to this one will be Mr. Stein, then Mr. Chan, then Professor Filindra. What about the people who have been in the United States for many years, working, never having committed a serious crime, with family members who are U.S. citizens? What should we do in that situation? Should the golden rule play a part? Do unto others as we'd like to be done unto us?
Well, that's a very broad hypothetical. I mean, remember, the reason why we have a political stalemate on the immigration policy issue now, particularly in Congress, is that the president historically has had a constitutional responsibility to carry out the laws to the letter, and particularly in immigration law and policy, which is this is a plenary power of the Congress and arguably one of those very important exclusive authorities of the federal government in carrying out, like national defense, border security is one of those attributes of sovereignty. The president's unprecedented expansion of his discretion in the context of the Deferred Action Program and now what seems to be a broadening what's called enforcement priority framework that seems to include now millions and millions of people here illegally, is marginalizing the role of Congress and undermining the confidence of the general public in Congress that any new laws that it passed would be effectively enforced. The question of what to do in grandfathering people who have strong equities, who've been here for many, many years, have strong ties, is the kind of question that you want to address after you first drill down to examine how did we get in the situation we're in today in the first place. Because historically we've had something called a registry date in the law that operates like a statute of limitations in immigration policy that allows an alien, if he or she can prove continuous residence for an extended number of years and good character and absence of criminal record, to adjust status. But in 1986, when Ronald Reagan signed the amnesty bill, the Immigration Control and Reform Act, there was a solemn promise made by politicians, for what that's worth, elected officials. Their lips were moving, I know. Why did we believe them? But anyway, they said this was going to be the last one. Now, there's a specific, very definable train of events between 1986 and 2014 that led us to the current situation now where we allegedly have millions and millions of people here illegally. I don't know how many people are here illegally. I hear numbers bandied about. But in order to reform, true reform of immigration law, you have to fix what exactly the things that are broken that led us to the situation we are in today. You can't just go and pass a big blanket amnesty program and then turn around and say, okay, we fixed the system. You have to drill down and say, all right, why do we have this recurring problem, and how can we prevent it in the future? In the Senate legislation, which is what they're pushing through the House, there's no effort to really deal with that question. So these are very, that's something you would have to answer before you could get into the question of slicing and dicing who has the equities to remain here.
Sure. So once again, the equities question really is directly relevant to what we consider as important as a value, right? So if you have someone who has been no criminal activities, a large amount of the community, one of the first questions you ask is, well, how are they not an American in every sense of the word, right? If they are a community member that's been contributing well, they do, of course, pay taxes in many ways, if at least in sales taxes. In what way are they not contributing to the fabric of our communities, and what will it cost to expel that person? What will it mean to our communities when we decide that we are going to rip them apart? One of the points that I wanted to make before that I didn't get to was really one of the costs of talking about these laws is not the cost on the undocumented immigrants themselves, but on us. I'll give you a quick example of this. We're talking about enforcement. So my wife and I went to go visit my brother-in-law who lives in Washington, the state of Washington, in a little bit of a far-off area. And, of course, you fly in to one city, then you get on a bus, and you take the bus an hour and a half to go to visit him. When we got on the bus, there was a bunch of university students there because we were going to a university area, and we were waiting in line. And, of course, 2 ICE officials board the bus and start asking for identification. This is one of the costs of enforcement. I'm going to have to sit there and decide that I have to show my driver's license, but, of course, because I spoke English in a certain fluency, they never got asked another question. But that's not always going to be what's going on. So when we talk about these equities of this person who has become a fabric or members of the community, there is going to be a cost to trying to find who they are. Are we really prepared, as we already have in Union Station, to have ICE officials take a look at you, decide whether or not you look American enough such that you need a second question about whether or not you are actually American? Or are we really going to have a situation, and this is the other aspect in why libertarians tend to view this debate, is because this is going to require policing almost every aspect of our economic and our civil life. The fact of the matter is a lot of undocumented immigrants are caught up in the immigration system doing things that normally we consider as part of our everyday life. Driving, going to court, going to apply for a job, and trying to do things that we normally would do. And if we really want to be serious about enforcement, what the cost of that will be for us is to tolerate that level of intrusion into our very lives. So yes, I think the question is the cost of dealing with someone in that situation is so high because it's not just to them, but for the rest of us, that really we need a mechanism that allows them to come forward and say, you know what, I should be given at least a shot at explaining why I should be allowed to stay in the United States, and perhaps what has been need to be formally recognized of what's already being done in my everyday life.
So I think that my personal view is that we have very deep ethical obligations to all people who share this land because they're human beings, not because they're citizens of this country or permanent residents or belong in any other category. As a human society, we have deep ethical obligations. And the worldviews of most Americans are informed by the Bible. From what I hear from seminarians and professors of religion, there are at least 40 passages within the Bible that say we have an obligation to protect and shield the stranger. And I can assure you, it does not say that the stranger has to have an H-1B visa, or that the stranger has to have status in the United States, or that the stranger has to be of a specific type. According to the Bible, sharing and showing love to strangers is the path for internal balance and also earthly riches. And we are expected to shelter and protect each other in times of need, and this is for everybody, not people who came here in one way or a different way. The biblical tradition introduces no qualifications, which makes me think that I do not have the moral authority to invent them and make them up. So from my perspective, there is a normative obligation that we have coming out of a very strong Judeo-Christian tradition that exists in this country. Another historical basis for why we need to think twice here and why it is important to include people who have lived here for a long time comes from from our history and from especially the history of the early part of the United States. How many of you have heard of the Antenati? Anyone? The Antenati were people who were born prior to the U.S. Revolution, the American Revolution, and who actually sided with the British during the Revolutionary War. And once the war was over, some of them returned to England and became British citizens, and some of them remained in the United States and stayed here for a long time. And as a result of the Antenati, a number of court cases arose during the late 18th century to decide whether these people had claims to citizenship and whether they could remain in the United States as members of this society. And these were people who actually had betrayed the American Revolution, right? These were the people that if you have a hierarchy of undesirables, most people would put them at the top. Yet, the American justice system decided that because time had elapsed and because these people had stayed in the United States past the revolution for several years, the state had essentially given them implicit consent to be here and to become American citizens and to remain here. So this is a group of people that, for most intents and purposes, were really the enemy of the United States. And yet, we adhere to the norms that we include people, even if we don't like them very much, because they have lived here for a long time. Time of residence is a very important legal and ethical tradition and consideration when it comes to inclusion. A third issue that we need to think about is the issue of what happens when we exclude people. Because there is this idea that the Supreme Court, too, is actually sort of promoting when you read Justice Scalia's decisions and discussions, where there is this talk about, well, these people are going back home. We're sending them home. And for many people, home sounds like a good thing. It sounds like, where you want to be. It sounds like where good things happen to you. Well, let's think about that for a minute. What does this home mean for somebody who was brought in the United States at the age of 2, speaks no other language other than English, has been educated here, has never been to whatever country, and is sent back on their own to fend for themselves, and in some cases to very, very dangerous circumstances. And it's not just places that have incredible violence, like places in Central America, but also places that don't share American custom and where you become a target just because of the way you dress and the way you walk. There is research now being done by anthropologists and sociologists all over the world. And examples come from Somalia, where American deportees in Somalia, female American deportees in Somalia, are targeted because even when they wear a full burqa and they're totally covered, these women have a way of walking that marks them and identifies them as different. And they become targets for sexual assault, for rape, and for murder. There are cases from Jamaica where deportees are stigmatized because they came back, they were rejected by the United States, and regardless of what caused their deportation, even people who had no criminal records in the United States are being hunted down by vigilantes. There is an incredible risk that we are putting these people into, and in many ways, we're complicit in that. We cannot just sit back and say we're sending them home without actually thinking about the repercussions of what's happening to them. And yes, the law under certain circumstances and for some few cases will make exceptions, but for the most part, the way that deportations are processed in the United States, in mass numbers, in groups of 20 and 30 people, with a judge being in a monitor someplace else in another state, there is no opportunity, there are no resources, there is no time to actually think and process what is happening to these people, where are we sending them to, and what will be there for them. And just, we have an ethical obligation to answer these questions before we ship somebody back to home.
Thank you. If the audience does have questions, please write them on the card. Peter's in the back here. I think this is going to be the last question for the panel. We are running short on time. And please write your questions down so the audience can participate. In terms of economics, and we're going to start with Mr. Chan, then Mr. Stein, then Ms. Filindra. In terms of economics, many studies are saying that a legalization or an amnesty would be a boon to the economy, generating enormous amount of tax revenues that would outpace the costs and incentivize investment in the country, people buying land and things like that, investing in businesses. And then also, so how are we supposed to look at those studies? And then also, how would a legalization affect the unemployed population? Because that's a big question out there.
Well, I mean, obviously, my response to if there's a ton of studies that say X, well, let's start to maybe trust a little bit in X, right? But I think you can also look at these things and think about it in just a logical, rational way, right? If you have a people of a country who are essentially being forced to participate in an underground economy, right? Underground economy because they are not allowed to work legally, as Mr. Stein mentioned. A lot of them may have false documents, but many of them also simply work in ways in which the government is not party to, their money, right? So if you think about marijuana legalization as being a way to look about an underground economy, in some ways, obviously, we're not equating controlled substances to immigrants, but you are talking about creating, moving people from an underground economy to a legal economy. And that benefits all of us, right? That means all the money that they were working and saving when they were undocumented suddenly becomes money that's going to be more available to grow the economy as part of the economic system that will be a benefit to all of us. Now, one of the more difficult economic questions is what's going to happen to wages of unskilled workers when we suddenly decide that a number of people who are undocumented will suddenly be able to compete on the legal labor market, right? And some studies have said that there would be a short-term wage depression. It should be interesting to note that that means people who are currently employed might suddenly see their wages go lower, and there might be an increased unemployment for that, because you are suddenly bringing in X number of people for Y number of jobs. But of course, that I think misses the point, because one, that's a short-term effect. Because most ways of looking at it, if you think about it long-term, what ends up happening is more people being able to legally participate in the economy grows the economy, which means more jobs, which means higher wages. And that's been borne out by studies that are looking at this as a question. Now, I think what this really means, though, is that we all need to also back up a federal minimum wage raise, right? If we all say the federal minimum wage is now $10.10 an hour, as well as creating an amnesty for whatever number you want to pick, 5 million, 8 million, 10 million more people, that actually is something that you won't necessarily see as much of a wage depression. There's debate about whether unemployment, but really I think the economic, as pointed out by Dr. Filindra, the economic minutia is an important part of this, but at the end, I think what we're going to see is that these value questions are what's going to be driving these issues. But if you want an idea of what the commerce and the industry thinks, well, high tech all want immigration reform. Agro-businesses all want immigration reform. Look at who are on the members of the aisles who are actually looking and trying to change immigration reform, and they all tend to be businesses and people who are very much interested in growing our economy. Half of all startups in Silicon Valley were from non-citizens. A majority of U.S. patents are being held by non-citizens. So there is definite economic power in these people who are undocumented currently. But really, I think the better question to ask is, how are we going to make the immigration system that we want be able to harness that economic power? Part of it is going to be how to deal with undocumented, but the other part is how are we going to go ahead and let more people who are able to contribute to our country and our economy in? And right now, we are not doing a good job of that.
Mr. Stein.
Well, in Washington parlance, there's something that our opposition refers to as the Rights Market Coalition. The Rights Market Coalition represent the so-called civil rights industry bonding with the so-called cheap labor industrial complex trying to push through the Senate immigration bill. The sad reality of what drives immigration policy is that it's not necessarily a highly moralistic or ethical framework. It's sheer exploitation and greed. If you take a look at the history of the Industrial Revolution going all the way back to early England, I mean, part of the reason that child labor was introduced, women were put to work under exploitative conditions in the factories, was the argument was made by the captains of industry that English exports needed to be competitive, so wage rates had to be driven down. If you look at the political battles going all the way back to even to the very early contract labor laws in the 1860s, the issue with how contract labor was being brought over from Asia was the fact that the labor contractors were bringing over labor gangs, and they were considered as competing with free labor. And of course, a lot of the Civil War was about the ability of free labor to move into the new territories if the institution of slavery was allowed to continue into the new territories. After the Civil War, of course, it's very clear that modern capitalism relies upon a new slave class coming into the society on a regular basis in order to, quote, do the work. And why is it, when I asked that question earlier, why is it we're in this situation 25 years after 1986, we have a large illegal immigrant population again? The answer is business groups have opposed state and local cooperation, secure documents, proper and effective interior detention deportation procedures, and the deterrent value that would actually make our laws have meaning. And what we see again happening in Washington is all the arguments about who's going to benefit or not can be seen in the experience of the last 30 years. We've had the highest sustained level of immigration, legal and illegal, in this country and even world history in the last 35 years. There's no nation that in the modern world that actually has been able to survive that didn't control its perimeter, its borders. Take a look at the stability of the American middle class in the 1960s, the wage gap between rich and poor, the level of unionization in our society, and the strength of what the wage worker could buy in the 60s. It's one of the untold stories of the civil rights movement is that by unleashing a tidal wave of additional immigration beginning in the 1970s forward, this community helped undermine the very basis for what was helping to build middle-class stability in the U.S. to the point where today it's virtually disappeared. And now, 2/3 of the new jobs created in the last several years have gone to the foreign-born. The people who are most directly affected by low-skill immigration are America's most vulnerable and least educated Americans. We see now the native-born labor force participation rate has declined to levels not seen now since the 70s. There's simply a displacement phenomenon going on because I don't want to diminish the economic contributions of highly skilled, industrious, and talented immigrants because they contribute mightily. But as a phenomenon, on the meta-market sense, what you see, and you have to be blind not to see what's going on in our society, is the American native-born labor force is simply being driven out of all sectors of the American labor market, whether it's working in agriculture all the way up to working in programming or engineering. And it's the existence of such a high sustained rate of immigration is having a disequilibrating effect on the normal labor market recruitment phenomenon that would be going on in our K-12 and academic institutions, because there is a preference for the exploitable worker. And this is a powerful political force. Make no mistake about it. To sanction and condone sustained illegal behavior because you believe it's the right thing to do, or to turn around and suggest we need to move to a Darwinian open borders scenario where anybody who wants to come can come, is to set in motion the kind of Darwinian sort of social forces that historically proper immigration controls were designed to prevent.
Wow. We have a lot of evidence from economics that immigration makes its own demand. It creates demand. People who come in, they rent housing, they create their own little businesses, they work locally. It actually can have a very salutary effect at the local level. Immigration also alleviates the problem of population decline. We are at a time when people are not having more than 1 or 2 kids, and we are dealing with the effects of a baby boom generation that is enormous, that you and me will not be able to support through their 90s, which is how long they're going to live, and then have the ability to draw on Social Security and on benefits for our lifetime, for when we are old. Immigration can provide a boost to our social programs and cushion us to a certain extent from this this very, very difficult next 30 years. Unfortunately, we were born in the wrong time from that perspective. It's going to cost us a lot of money. So from that perspective, I think that in the long term, immigration provides a really strong way to deal with long-term economic problems that we're having. It also provides innovation and talent across classes. Yes, there are problems of exploitation, and yes, there are thousands of people who are brought in and they're paid subpar wages, or even worse, they're trafficked. Those are not arguments for closing the border and reducing immigration flows. Those are arguments for providing more resources to the Labor Department to enforce labor laws and to provide protections. Those are arguments for increasing the minimum wage and providing people with the ability to have a quality of life, regardless of whether they were brought in or came in legally or illegally, they're citizens or not citizens. So from my perspective, I think that I'm very optimistic about the ability of immigration to add to economic development for the country. And that has been actually the traditional view of the United States going back to the early 19th century. We realized that population growth is the engine to grow and develop the country. And that is why in the 1870s, 22 states met in Indianapolis and had a huge fight because they were competing against each other for who's going to get the best and the brightest and the better qualified immigrants. They recognized that in-migration and an increasing population is a strength. It's not a weakness. And we can see it today if we compare the U.S. to Europe. Diversity, as Mr. Stein mentioned, is a difficult situation to manage. Again, that does not mean that we should have a homogeneous nation. I don't see the solution to Americans' internal tensions as being get rid of those people who don't quite look like us. America has actually done a pretty good job of integrating groups and making Americans out of a huge variety of people. We are really good. We have a strong tradition in our educational system of respecting diversity and of allowing people to become part of our society. And we're extremely successful at it. It's one of the things that we do really, really well. And compared to what's happening in Europe, because part of my research is actually in Greece, where they have a Nazi party going around telling people that they are going to kill immigrants and anybody who doesn't look Greek or is not Greek. We have done a pretty good job, and we should be proud. And we should continue in that tradition, and we should continue to put an emphasis on integration to help people become Americans faster and become part of this society. We know that the second generation who are American-born are Americans throughout, and we need to assist and do a better job the way that Canada does in terms of helping people to naturalize, helping people get through the process. So I don't see diversity as something that we need to be afraid of. I see diversity as something that we should be proud of and that we should face the challenges in a productive way.
Thank you. All right. I do have some questions from the audience. And first one, Mr. Stein. How do we deal with citizen children that are left behind when a parent is deported?
How well? Citizen children who were born here in this country. Well, this again, like 3 Congresses ago, there was an effort to begin to deal with this interpretation of the 14th Amendment that says if the mother is here illegally and has been here for 5 minutes but happens to have a child on U.S. soil, the child is considered a U.S. citizen. And not surprisingly, one of the key points that I haven't been able to really make at this point from the standpoint of an immigration lawyer. You know, in a criminal context, delay is prejudicial to the defendant, and that's why the Constitution guarantees the right to a speedy trial. But in the immigration context, delay actually can be, not always, but can be of enormous benefit to an alien without any colorable claim to be in the country. And there are all kinds of ways in which buying time, if you will, to extend the process can lead to the development of what we call equities in the immigration context. And because the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War to try to prevent states from arbitrarily denying citizenship to persons born within the jurisdiction of each state. See, prior to the Civil War, states had the right to decide who could be a citizen and who couldn't. That has now been interpreted to mean that even if the mother has never submitted herself to a port of entry, there has been no consent by the American people to admit her, there's been no formal assertion of jurisdiction, nevertheless she's able to bestow citizenship on the child, with the effect that over time, as the management of immigration has continued to deteriorate, you have a lot of people who have had children born here as U.S. citizens, whereas the children of ambassadors and other certain non-immigrant classifications, their children are not considered citizens. So it's not an iron fast rule. So then the problem becomes, what do you do if you have a minor U.S. citizen child, particularly one who's young? Well, traditionally, of course, the parent takes the child home with them. They assert guardianship and they take the child home. If you remember, well, I think most of you are old enough to remember the Elian Gonzalez case in the early 1990s. That was a question of whether family law rules, going down to the very local county level in Florida, trumped these international rules, regulations, federal law, separation of powers in the immigration and foreign relations context, whether the father could assert the right to bring Elian Gonzalez back to Cuba, which ultimately it was ruled he could. So in the end, the answer is, for most minor children, the parents should take them home with them, which they're allowed to do under U.S. and international law.
Mr. Chan, do you want to give a brief answer?
Sure. I think, first of all, this interpretation that Mr. Stein mentions is a Supreme Court case that was decided in the 19th century. And yes, there has been a scholarly academic argument that it should have been interpreted differently. Fortunately for us, I think you can just also look at whether or not it'd be a good policy by looking at Germany. Right? There are countries that don't recognize birthright citizenship. And what ends up happening is you get generations after generations of people who have been in the country who are not given legal status. That's not what we want. Even if we didn't have the absolute, trying to change the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, giving birthright citizenship, yes, it was designed to prevent states from doing arbitrary citizenship laws. But really, it was a fundamental change to what we consider how the country can treat people and what it means to be a citizen. I would vociferously argue that the 14th Amendment should stay the way it is. But the question about whether or not families are allowed to take their child home, well, that's not so simple. You have a citizen parent with a non-citizen spouse, and therefore you have a citizen child. What happens when the undocumented parent, or documented, right? A lot of times people have lawful permanent resident. They came here lawfully, just like Mr. Stein wants, just like everyone wants. They came here, they have a green card, they marry a U.S. citizen, they have a child. They haven't naturalized yet. Something happens, they're facing deportation. What happens to that child? Well, the child will have to be separated from one parent. Whether it's both, probably not, unless it's put into foster care system. But these are difficult questions, and these are questions that are being forced upon us because we have a deportation system that tends to undercount family ties.
Brief response, very brief.
I don't see how reducing rights to people solves any of our problems. It can't be that our instinct to any problem should be to reduce rights for people. And it can't be that we create a two-tier citizenship system in order to resolve what to do with a child who's an American citizen, take away his American citizenship. I think these are tragic situations, and convoluted legal principles apply, and we need to be far more careful in how we deal with the thousands, and we're talking about several thousand children who fall into this category and then into the category of unaccompanied minors. This is a group that requires incredible sensitivity and responsibility on our part.
Mr. Chan, I believe you said that there have been laws in American history that people thought were unjust, and they were working toward changing them. And in some instances, people did not follow these laws. Can you give us some examples and talk about why that's important?
Well, of course, I mean, the civil rights movement, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, you have slavery laws, you have labor laws. It used to be that we allowed children to work in factories. We don't allow that anymore. There's countless examples where people protested against what they consider as unfair laws. Now, should those people who broke those laws still be considered criminals? That's a separate question and a completely different debate. But the point is, just like we see DACA children who are out there on the streets protesting against these laws, it forces us and should force us to examine whether the laws themselves are just. Should they be changed? While we have absolutely an obligation to follow laws, even though we may not agree with them, we also have a very powerful tradition of questioning laws and asking and requiring them to change when they are unjust.
Mr. Stein, how do you see the comparison with this in the civil rights debate?
Well, I think there's a political effort to try to make that analogy, but the analogy really breaks down because this is not about, there's no analogous scenario here. We're talking about people who have made a decision voluntarily to come into this country illegally, without the consent of the American people, jumping in front of millions and millions of people, seeking the right to hold employment, to gain access to American public education, public benefits. All you have to do is study Anne Zatunji's scenario to understand why the American taxpayer would be offended at the idea that people should feel they have a right to essentially come in illegally and immediately make demands for public benefits. And people who come illegally, we haven't gotten into this question of the economics of low-skill immigration, but it is operating as an enormous labor subsidy where employers pocket the wage differential of the lower-cost labor, but taxpayers have to pay for education, housing, health care, health insurance, infrastructure, highways, roads, and what have you. The value added of a low-skill illegal alien worker is simply not going to cover the infrastructural costs to sustain that person in a post-industrial information society. It operates as a powerful labor subsidy, and this is what creates the enormous political force to try to drive. It's why the Chamber of Commerce is actually the most powerful proponent in favor of future illegal immigration. Because make no mistake, if the Senate bill were to pass and we wiped a slate clean over the 10 or 11 million people here illegally, there would be the same push by business, certain business, to drive more illegal immigration because they need that subordinated component of the labor market, they believe. And while you make the argument the minimum wage is important to enforce, we've made the argument, well, of course that's important, but the concomitant of that has to be, interior immigration enforcement, secure verification system to establish work eligibility. Cesar Chavez was a very strong proponent of border security and border control because he understood that border control was important to assure the bargaining leverage of farm workers. In the same way that the Democratic Party historically has been characterized by a very strong labor protection component in the AFL-CIO, which ultimately collapsed in the 1990s as the American labor movement collapsed. And now we've outsourced all these manufacturing jobs, insourced all these foreign workers. The average American is kind of being left in economic limbo with very insecure economic prospects, and the Senate bill is going to take a very dire economic situation. And how does this make anything easier for the average American? right? You could argue also that the congestive effect of additional population growth through immigration increases real estate costs, which also has an effect on U.S. fertility rates, as American families find it more difficult to make ends meet without having two income earners. There's nothing, if I leave you with one thought, it's just, this is an extremely complex subject, and anyone who says they have all the answers, there's only one side. I can even cite scripture for the proposition that a nation has the right unilaterally to control its borders and be very aggressive with anyone who tries to occupy that space. There is no simple one side to this issue. It is enormously dynamic and complex, and what I appreciate about the exchange here today is I feel it's been very respectful, and I appreciate that.
Brief response.
Economic rationality is not a sufficient basis for policy. We need to include normative principles that come out of our values, because the economic argument that the cost of infrastructure is too high, what we provide to people is too high, does not only apply to immigrants. What about African Americans on the South Side? Where do we deport them? What about old people who cost us millions in cancer drugs? What do we do with them? Those death panels may sound interesting now under these circumstances. We have an obligation, and we can't do these arguments of normative subcategorization of people into legal, illegal, H-1Bs, anchor babies, welfare mothers. These essentially have an effect of debasing our collective humanity. Their essential purpose is to refute the structural drivers of human action, and as a result, they negate our collective responsibility and deep, very, very deep culpability in creating conditions that drive people to leave their home and family. We focus on categories because we know that they're effective emotional symbols, and they activate latent predispositions and negative affect. Categorization of this type brings out the worst in people, but it does so in a way that allows us to collectively pretend that we have not breached cherished norms of equality and justice.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. I believe the panelists will stay a little after if anybody has any questions. I wasn't able to get to all the audience questions. Please give a round of applause for our panel. Thank you, everybody, for coming.